China and North Korea are on high alert. The silence in the Far East alliance has given way to panic. Because the Pacific is no longer just an ocean, it has become the stage for U.S. military power. The U.S. is now gradually unleashing the deterrent power it has been building up for a long time. Missile launchers have shifted the balance, and B-2 Spirit aircraft have emerged from the shadows and taken off from the runway. Ohio-class submarines advance silently in the depths. F-35s gliding through the sky and aircraft carriers gliding through the sea showed what they meant without needing to say a word. The Pacific is now under Washington's control. The power dynamics have been shaken to their core. It is no longer maps that speak, but moving war groups and traces on radar screens. How did the U.S. manage to regain absolute dominance in the Pacific? Washington introduced a three-layered pressure architecture into the Indo-Pacific theater, starting in the summer of 2025. This architecture trapped China, Russia, and North Korea in a simultaneous land-air-sea containment model. At the core of this model are the SM-6 and Tomahawk dual missile configuration of Typhoon land-based launchers in Australia, the nuclear or conventional armed B-52H, B-2A bomber, trio rotating around the Guam Diego Garcia axis, and the cyclical deployment of Virginia Block V-class attack submarines. However, the primary impact stems from the integration of this platform set into regional allied protocols as a network patch. The Pentagon has linked South Korea's KAMD radar network, Japan's Aegis ashore facilities, the 5 forward air corridors allocated by the Philippines under the EDCA expansion, Australia's Jorn Phase 6 early warning line, and Taiwan's Liangshan underground HADR command center into a single federated data body. This has exposed China's Eastern Theater Command to total sensor saturation. The Russian Pacific Fleet's command chain has been forced into a continuous radar on-off cycle in passive mode along the Vladivostok-Ussuri line. North Korea, meanwhile, had to accept the risk of being detected by ANTPY-2 superband scanning with every Hwasong test launch. The land component of the encirclement, which had been symbolic until now, has expanded to a numerical scale with the deployment of 4 Typhoon batteries at Robertson Barracks on Australia's northern coast in May 2025. 7 additional launchers included in the U.S. Army's mid-range capability package will be deployed in the Cairns-Darwin corridor within 18 months. Each capable of carrying 2 SM-6 or 4 Tomahawk missiles, a total of 56 ready-to-fire munitions will remain on continuous duty. The range circle will expand to cover the South China Sea Islands, the Taiwan Strait, the Bohai Gulf, and even the Petropavlovsk submarine base on the Russian coast. Shambi GC Point Night, the naval component, is the standoff strike modular module of the Seawolf and Virginia submarines entering the Pacific Fleet's operational cycle. Cyan PAS-CWIS with the Block 5 hull extension, the Virginia payload module has reached a capacity of 40 to 42 Tomahawks, enabling a single submarine to maintain a continuous salvo line in the South China Sea for days without surfacing. At the same time, the ANBQQ-10 sonar package tracks Epelayan Yuan-class AIP boats from behind and conducts joint target designation with MQ-9B Sea Guardian swarms. The air leg is a bomber rotation, rotating in the Anderson/Tinian/Diego Garcia triangle. B-52H bombers offer a 980-kilometer standoff capability with AGM-158B Jacimar missiles, while B-2A Spirit bombers, thanks to their low observability capabilities, can penetrate below the radar thresholds of China's HQ-9B and Russia's S-400 batteries to continue carrying JDAM-ER or GBU-57A-B MOP munitions. The secret hangar foundations being prepared in Guam for containerized B-21As already foreshadow the 4th-generation attack silhouette for 2027 and beyond. The psychological component is also of critical importance. After the SM-6 launch on June 6, 2025, the Central Military Commission of the Communist Party of China responded by simultaneously dispatching the Fujian and Shandong aircraft carriers to the Western Pacific. However, U.S. Indio PACOM satellite analysis showed that aircraft carrier maintenance cycles in the Liaoning shipyard area had been started earlier than planned. It was reported that this created an unsustainable resource consumption for the dual-carrier show of force. Similarly, Russia moved its Bastion P coastal defense systems to the Kuril chain. However, Japanese Self-Defense Forces EP-3C SIGINT platforms intercepted all 18 Bastion radio frequency packets. Range statistics were dropped into an open-source signal database. This information was processed into the U.S. Navy's LO-FAR grid within 72 hours. As a result, Russian coastal defense became detectable. Pyongyang's 3 ballistic tests in response to the Pentagon's layered pressure concept failed to go beyond creating ballistic traces on the ANSP-Y-6 radar. This is because the density of Aegis destroyers around the Korean peninsula is at its highest level in a decade, with each destroyer layer overlapping another. The shell-shaped signal geometry is also suffocating the Type 055 and Type 052D destroyers in China's Hainan region. The strategic logic behind all these tough-looking steps is simple. By reducing conventional response times in the Indo-Pacific from hours to minutes, and even seconds in some areas, the U.S. is making the area denial doctrine of the China-Russia-North Korea axis unsustainable in terms of cost. This is because keeping rivals' radar networks in a permanent high alert mode inflates maintenance budgets, depletes air defense stocks, and most importantly, causes personnel fatigue and sensor wear and tear. At the same time, the U.S. is expanding its moves through allied network synergy rather than relying solely on its own platforms. Japan has increased its stockpile of SM-3 Block 2A missiles to 124, with 2 based on land and 3 on ships, by the end of 2025. Australia has procured AGM-158C LRA-SM missiles for its F-35A fleet under the U.S.'s Rotational Airborne Early Warning System, ROTA Recap Agreement. The Philippines has deployed a NASAMS air defense battery at the Cagayan 3 EDCA base at the northern tip of Luzon. Taiwan has integrated the Chien-Kung 4, a Manpad's derivative of the Stinger, into its Patriot PAC-3 MSE stockpile. South Korea has updated its kill chain doctrine, officially incorporating counter-battery fire by HIMARS upon detection of North Korean SRBM launch pads into its protocols. Thus, the U.S. encirclement is not limited to Washington-based black and gray platforms, but is integrating alliance-based network-centric fire support into a single kill web. China's claim that its artificial islands in the South China Sea are no-fly, no-entry zones has turned into a routine firing range within the daily exercise range. Seeing this, Beijing announced 4 days of exercises around Taiwan as a limited retaliation. However, the U.S. and its allies monitored and exposed all telemetry from the exercises in real time. Sky Guardian and RQ-4B Global Hawk MQ-4C Triton conducted signal interception. In summary, submarines remained invisible in the Indo-Pacific, and bombers continued to remain invisible. Typhoon launchers are camouflaged on land, but all these invisible assets are creating a very visible hole in the defense budgets of China, Russia, and North Korea. Overheating radars, sailing aircraft carriers on high alert, and keeping missiles stockpiled and ready to fire are the main weapons of the budget-draining war. The U.S. is doing exactly that in the Pacific, step by step. Without firing a shot, the high-frequency pressure cycle is eroding rival budgets, and as the cycle accelerates with sensor fusion, it becomes even more powerful. The first test launch of the SM-6 in Australia was not a prototype, but a template. A Typhoon can be deployed on every Allied coastline, and each Typhoon means 2 SM-6s or 4 Tomahawks, pushing Chinese or Russian air and naval assets further inland with each new launch pad. The name is new in U.S. strategic documents, but the logic is classic. The strategic choke point is a cycle-based strategy that traps ships in port without destroying the fleet, forces radars to remain operational day and night without being jammed, and cripples the economy with military spending. Defense experts in Beijing call this the dual pressure trap. Moscow uses the term prolonged stress game, while Pyongyang depicts it on propaganda screens as the approaching shadow of the U.S. But whatever the name, the math remains the same. By expanding its control surfaces in the Pacific, Washington is narrowing its rivals' political space and redefining the balance not in terms of the number of weapons, but in terms of perception and response time. In the second layer of the encirclement, the U.S.'s command and control as a service approach is hitting the ground. The Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control, CJADC2, end-to-end test scenario in the Pacific, was run from scratch in network gateway trials covering the Okinawa-Anderson-Hickam Triangle. The data backbone ran through Starlink V2 mini-satellites. X-band packets rising from the Japanese Self-Defense Forces IAMD Control Center entered the JAD-C2 cloud at the same millisecond as SAR strips from the Philippines P-8A Poseidon Patrol. Here, the AI-powered Firestorm algorithm processed the threat and recommended an AGM-158B salvo against the B-52 group in Guam as the most likely strike element. When operators approved the recommendation, the aircraft had not yet taken off. However, the target coordinates had already been loaded into the mission computers. This created a shock in China's PLAF command center, having the classic OODA loop. While the detection decision action process took minutes for the adversary, it had dropped below seconds in the U.S. network. During the same exercise, no actual cruise missile launches were conducted at Australia's Woomera test range. However, a virtual package simulating the Tomahawk flight profile was fired in a 3D environment. Since China's Beidou positioning satellites could not physically observe this event, strategy analysts recorded it as a ghost salvo. In other words, while the U.S. is conducting tests with real ammunition on one hand, it has also begun to strain the rival's satellite sensing resources by blurring the line between real and virtual. When Russia noticed this hybrid pressure, it began reprogramming the communication segments of its PION-NKS satellites to increase SATCOM listening capacity in the Eastern Military District. However, the bandwidth of the PION-NKS teams was insufficient for CJDC2 data speeds. This time, Moscow was forced to update its Surus ME codebooks. The Russians ran their sensor network in low-resolution mode for 2 weeks due to the unscheduled software update, while U.S. submarines freely roamed beneath the Kuril Strait. This incident provided a vivid example of the sensor fatigue doctrine. On the North Korean side, the U.S.-South Korea kill chain exercise prompted Pyongyang to test attack drones using GPS jammers. However, the L-band antennas of the THAAD radars and the F-35A EODAS package reverse-engineered the jamming signal. The drone swarm was tracked via its own RF emissions 12 minutes after takeoff, and HIMARS GMLRS strikes hit the drone runway for the first time. The video of this test was not shared, but the South Korean Ministry of Defense confirmed the damage during a press briefing, making the message clear. Even tactical hybrid solutions cannot escape U.S. network power scanning. When read together, all these activities show that Washington's Pacific strategy is not just about deploying weapons, but about making the enemy's decision-making cycle costly, stressful, and impossible in terms of time. When Beijing launched the PLA Navy's Type 003 Fujian aircraft carrier, the goal was to expand the A2AD umbrella. However, the U.S.'s mobile SM-6 Tomahawk nodes quickly pierced the edges of that umbrella. The bombardment trio in Guam threatened the inner ring. Virginia-class submarines surrounded the outer ring. As a result, China's surface fleet was forced to constantly burn fuel, fill pilot flight hours, and consume engine life in the Harbor Sea pendulum. The same scenario applied to the Russian Pacific Fleet. As so many destroyers and Staragushchi corvettes embarked on distant sea patrols, U.S. P-8A aircraft remained in the shadows along the Alaska-Honshu line, equipped with MAD, magnetic anomaly detectors. Once a target is detected, a submarine destroyer contact chain is established. This chain, tested for years in the Persian Gulf, has now been transferred to the Pacific, and the psychological dimension of the strategy should not be overlooked. On the day the SM-6 was fired from Australia, the hashtag "Will the missile launched from Darwin hit Guangdong?" surpassed 1 billion views on Weibo. State censors removed the first version of the hashtag, but the topic resurfaced within 24 hours. Public pressure forced Chinese defense agencies to bring forward a second maintenance check for the Liaoning, as the public was asking, "Are our aircraft carriers almost defenseless?" The budgetary impact of this question was reported as an additional $4.8 billion in maintenance funds. Meanwhile, Russia's decision to modernize its Vladivostok defenses in response to the U.S. move on Guam will require an additional 1.1 trillion rubles in spending. Given the ruble's depreciation, this is straining Moscow's budget, already struggling with sanctions, without opening a second front in the Pacific. North Korea, meanwhile, is responding with more limited resources. It has moved KN-25 rocket artillery capable of carrying potential tactical nuclear warheads to the coast of the Sea of Japan. However, these batteries are caged by Patriot PAC-3 and SM-3 blocks, and as they move freely along roads, the fuel maintenance personnel cycle is becoming increasingly expensive. As a result, Washington's Pacific encirclement can be described as the latest version of its strike-without-firing strategy. Wear down the enemy's weapons, age their radars, keep their pilots awake, slowly bleed their economy. In response to all this, China's Ministry of Defense Budget Bulletin has for the first time included a line item titled A2AD Sustainability. This subheading states that the additional costs for electricity, fuel, and human resources required to keep the defense network active 24/7 amount to $19.6 billion. Russia reported a similar secret line item under the name Eastern Region Inventory Renewal, the cost of which is not public, but the Moscow think tank CAST estimated it at 2.1 trillion rubles. There are no financial data available for North Korea, but it has been leaked that the solid fuel produced for 3 new missile tests was obtained from China in exchange for petrochemical raw materials. This puts further strain on Pyongyang's already tight foreign exchange reserves. In contrast, the U.S. side is keeping additional costs minimal because the Typhoon launch unit is shipped overseas in containers, and once the launchers are unloaded from the ship, they can operate in a self-sufficient logistics cycle. Tomahawk stocks are already in place. The SM-6 production line does not require additional spending beyond the 1,000-unit plan through 2027. Bombers are already available, and submarines are continuing their current operations. In other words, Washington is building deterrence without extending credit, while its rivals are spending from their budgets every time an alarm sounds. This is the invisible black box of encirclement, the sensor fire perception fatigue cycle. The U.S. strategy triggers the rivals' principle of defend by expending energy. On its own front, it is establishing cost-effective pressure with distributed, low-profile, mobile launchers and network-centric decision algorithms. The Pacific is thus becoming the new economic battlefield of the 21st century. Rockets are rarely fired, but every day a defense budget silently bleeds. This is exactly what Washington wanted. Not to win without fighting, but to wear down the opponent without fighting, and bring them to the table in a weaker position, GJ. The response from the China-Russia-North Korea bloc is currently limited to Navtech's warnings, show exercises, and expensive maintenance budgets. The result is quite clear. The circle of power in the Pacific has been redrawn, and Washington is no longer at the center of the new line, but rather Washington's alliance network and multi-layered firepower. As long as this network exists, Beijing will not be able to breathe deeply, Moscow will not be able to move its distant naval fleet, and Pyongyang will not be able to conduct any tests without risk. In other words, the Pacific now appears to be more than just an ocean. It is becoming a laboratory for long-term strategic erosion. At the final stage, the wear down and isolate formula is complete. The U.S. is not only directing pressure on the Indo-Pacific region toward the east, but is also making it more difficult for the bloc to interact internally. As the first production line for AUKUS opened in Adelaide, it was officially announced that the Royal Australian Navy will acquire Virginia-hulled SSN AUKUS submarines starting in 2030. With this decision, China's Malacca exit route intersects with a second silent nuclear line in the south. Japan announced that its mixed fleet of F-35 AF-35B aircraft will be increased from the initially planned 147 to 180. As a result, the air superiority line in the East China Sea is shifting northward to the center of the Taiwan Strait. The data-sharing agreement signed between South Korea and the Philippines also opens up North Korean launch activities to the Spratly image network. When Pyongyang conducts tests, the air sentry in the south receives real-time data. This adds a new ally sensor layer to the U.S. kill chain. This intertwined sensor-missile command mosaic results in the regional fragmentation of Beijing's combined firepower in near-seas doctrine. The same fracture applies to Russia and North Korea, as each new piece of sensor data triggers the East to be kept on a fixed threshold of conflict. Ultimately, the China-Russia-North Korea trio must first establish a secure tactical data link between themselves in order to produce a joint countermeasure. However, the cyber and RF pressure from the U.S. allied network is cutting this link before it can even form. Thus, Washington is simultaneously operating a model that disrupts the intelligence flow before firing and the supply maintenance cycle after firing. The Pacific theater has moved beyond the classic two navies facing each other equation and transformed into a chessboard of distributed nodes, autonomous sensors, and long-range land-based launchers. In this scenario, the side that makes quick decisions and uses low-cost fire solutions has the advantage. Present, that side is clearly the US-led alliance. Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang will likely either make concessions at the negotiating table or enter into a more costly arms race to reduce this pressure. Both paths serve Washington's strategic objectives. The goal is to secure the region for open sea trade and force rival bloc economies into unsustainable defense budgets. Thus, an unannounced but relentless energy expenditure war has begun in the Pacific. Missiles are silent, sonars are busy, radar screens never go dark. In such an environment, whoever fires the first shot will likely have already lost the preemptive accounting battle. Washington's encirclement targeted decision-making cycles, budgets, and public psychology before the sound of weapons, and has so far hit its mark. There is a clear balance sheet at the finish line. The U.S. has redefined the balance of power in the Pacific by integrating its missile-air-sea triad with mobile truck ramps, satellite-fed artificial intelligence, and a mix of floating and flying platforms. China, Russia, and North Korea are forced to play defense in this new coordinate system, and defense is always more expensive. The next chapter in the Pacific has yet to be written, but it is clear whose pen is holding the pen before the lines are filled. At the tip of that pen are Typhoon's quadruple containers, the strategic bombardment shadow over Guam's runway, and the silent vibrations of Virginia reactors patrolling the ocean floor. For now, the name of the game is deterrence, the method is economic attrition, and the outcome is panic mode on the opposing front. As long as this formula remains unchanged, the center of power on the Pacific map will continue to be centered on Washington. Thank you for watching.